Louis Armstrong stopped in the middle of the stage and saw something in the crowd, a 74-year-old man with tears streaming down his face, clutching a faded poster to his chest as if it were the most precious thing in the world. 1965, Chicago. The hall was packed with 12,000 people. Louis was delivering a magnificent performance as always. But there was something in that old man's gaze, not ordinary fan excitement, but a deep meaning that carried the weight of years, of loss, of something that desperately needed to be said. Louis stopped the song. He lowered the microphone. He looked into the audience. The old man had pressed the poster against his heart, his lips trembling, as if he had wanted to say something for years but never had the courage. Louis began walking from the stage toward the man. 12,000 people held their breath. And when the old man finally spoke, what he said changed Louis Armstrong's life forever. But to understand why those words hit Louis so deeply, we need to go back to what had been happening in both of their lives in the weeks before that night. Because this story isn't just about a concert, it's about two broken souls finding each other at exactly the right moment. If this story has already captured your heart, please subscribe to our channel, because what you're about to discover will remind you why music exists and what it truly means to touch another human being's soul. But this story doesn't begin on that stage in Chicago. It begins 3 weeks earlier in a small apartment in the south side of Chicago where a 74-year-old man named Walter Thompson sat alone in the darkness holding a photograph of his late wife. Walter had been a factory worker his entire life, spending 47 years at the same steel mill, coming home every evening to the same small house, to the same woman who had been his everything since he was 19 years old. Her name was Dorothy, and she had been gone for exactly 1 year, 3 months, and 12 days. Walter knew the count precisely because he had marked every single day on a calendar that hung in their kitchen, the kitchen where Dorothy used to hum Louis Armstrong songs while she cooked breakfast. Dorothy had loved Louis Armstrong more than any other musician in the world. She had discovered his music in the 1920s when she was just a teenager and had never stopped listening. Their first dance as a married couple had been to a Louis Armstrong record. Their children had been lullabied to sleep with Louis Armstrong songs. When Dorothy was diagnosed with cancer in 1963, she had asked Walter to play Louis Armstrong records in her hospital room. And he had, every single day for 11 months, until the morning when Dorothy closed her eyes for the last time while What a Wonderful World played softly in the background. The information in this video is compiled from documented interviews, archival news, books, and historical reports. For narrative purposes, some parts are dramatized and may not represent 100% factual accuracy. We also use AI-assisted visuals and AI narration for cinematic reconstruction. The use of AI does not mean the story is fake. It is a storytelling tool. Our goal is to recreate the spirit of that era as faithfully as possible. Enjoy watching. After Dorothy's passing, Walter had fallen into a darkness that seemed impossible to escape. Their children lived far away, one son in California, one daughter in Texas, and though they called regularly and visited when they could, Walter spent most of his days alone in the apartment that still smelled like Dorothy's perfume, that still had her reading glasses on the nightstand, that still felt like it was waiting for her to come home. The grief was overwhelming, a physical weight that pressed down on Walter's chest every morning when he woke up and remembered, again, that she was gone. For the first few months, Walter barely ate, barely slept, barely left the apartment except to buy groceries and visit Dorothy's grave. Friends from the factory tried to help, tried to get him out of the house, but Walter had no interest in living a life that didn't include Dorothy. What saved Walter Thompson was the same thing that had connected him to Dorothy for over 50 years, Louis Armstrong's music. One evening, about 6 months after Dorothy's passing, Walter was sitting in darkness when he accidentally knocked over a box of old records. As he picked them up, he found their copy of What a Wonderful World, the same record that had played during Dorothy's final moments. Walter put it on the turntable, not knowing if he could bear to hear it, and when Louis Armstrong's voice filled the apartment, something inside Walter cracked open. He cried, really cried, for the first time since the funeral, and in that crying, he found a strange kind of relief. The music didn't bring Dorothy back, but it brought back the feeling of her, the memory of her joy, the echo of all the happiness they had shared. From that night forward, Walter listened to Louis Armstrong every single day. He played the records in the morning when he woke up, in the evening when he ate dinner alone, at night when he couldn't sleep. The music became his companion, his connection to Dorothy, his reason to keep going when everything else felt pointless. Walter's daughter noticed the change during her next visit and was relieved to see her father eating again, talking again, showing signs of the man he had been before grief consumed him. She asked what had helped, and Walter simply said, "Louis." She didn't understand at first, but when she saw the stack of Louis Armstrong records next to her father's chair, she understood completely. Have you ever had a song or a musician help you through a difficult time? Share your experience in the comments. Meanwhile, in New York, Louis Armstrong was fighting his own battles. 1965 was a complicated year for Louis. He was 64 years old, still performing constantly, still beloved by millions, but increasingly aware that his body was betraying him. His heart had been giving him trouble for years, and his doctors had been urging him to slow down, to reduce his touring schedule, to prioritize his health over his career. But Louis couldn't stop performing any more than he could stop breathing. The stage was where he felt most alive, most connected, most like the person he was meant to be. Without performing, Louis didn't know who he was or what his life meant. The physical toll of decades of touring was becoming impossible to ignore. Louis's lips, which had been subjected to the intense pressure of trumpet playing for over 50 years, were often cracked and bleeding after performances. His breathing was labored, his energy diminished, his recovery time between shows longer than it had ever been. Lucille, his wife, watched with growing concern as Louis pushed himself through performances that clearly exhausted him. Performances that ended with Louis collapsing into chairs backstage, unable to move for long minutes while his body recovered from the exertion. She begged him to consider retirement or at least a significant reduction in his schedule, but Louis refused. The audiences needed him, he said. The music needed him, and truthfully, he needed them. Needed the applause, the connection, the confirmation that his life's work still mattered. But there was something else troubling Louis in those weeks before the Chicago concert, something he rarely discussed with anyone. Louis had been receiving letters from fans for decades, thousands upon thousands of letters expressing gratitude, sharing stories, telling him how his music had affected their lives. For years, Louis had read these letters with pleasure, with pride, with the satisfaction of knowing that his work meant something to people. But lately, the letters had started to affect him differently. Instead of feeling proud, Louis felt sad when he read them. Sad because he wondered if he had done enough, if his music had truly helped as many people as it could have, if he was living up to the responsibility that came with touching so many lives. Louis had grown up in poverty so extreme that most people couldn't imagine it. Born in New Orleans in 1901, he had spent his early childhood in a neighborhood so rough it was called the battlefield. His father had abandoned the family when Louis was an infant. His mother had struggled to survive, sometimes leaving Louis and his sister in the care of his grandmother while she worked. Louis had been arrested at 11 years old for firing a gun into the air during New Year's celebrations, and that arrest had sent him to the Colored Waifs Home for Boys, a reformatory that, ironically, had saved his life by introducing him to music. Every success Louis achieved, every milestone he reached, every audience he performed for, he carried with him the memory of that desperate child who had had nothing, who had been nobody, who had somehow found his way to stages around the world through sheer talent and determination. The weight of that journey sometimes overwhelmed Louis. He wondered if he had done enough to help others who came from similar circumstances. He wondered if his music, for all its popularity, had actually made a real difference in real people's lives. He wondered, in his darkest moments, if he was just an entertainer, someone who provided temporary distraction rather than genuine transformation. These doubts plagued Louis in the weeks before the Chicago concert, making him question whether all the physical sacrifice, all the years away from home, all the toll on his health had been worth it. He needed a sign, needed confirmation that his life's work had mattered. He just didn't know the sign was waiting for him in the fifth row of a Chicago concert hall. If you're moved by the story of two souls about to collide, please subscribe to stay with us until the end. Walter Thompson learned about the Chicago concert from a newspaper advertisement 3 weeks before the show. Louis Armstrong was coming to Chicago, the same Louis Armstrong whose music had been keeping Walter alive, whose voice had become Walter's daily companion, whose songs had somehow bridged the unbearable gap between Walter's life with Dorothy and his life without her. When Walter saw the advertisement, something stirred inside him that he hadn't felt since before Dorothy's illness, something that felt almost like excitement. He had never seen Louis Armstrong perform live. Dorothy had always wanted to, had talked about it for years, but somehow they had never made it happen. There was always something, work schedules, family obligations, not enough money, not enough time. And then it was too late, and Dorothy was gone, and the chance to share that experience with her had vanished forever. But now Louis Armstrong was coming to Chicago, and Walter made a decision. He was going to that concert. He was going to see the man whose music had saved him. And he was going to say thank you, something he had wanted to do for months, but had never imagined would be possible. Walter called the ticket office the same day he saw the advertisement, terrified that the concert might be sold out, relieved beyond words when the operator told him seats were still available. He bought one ticket, just one, because going alone was the only way he could imagine going, because sitting next to an empty seat would have been unbearable. The ticket cost Walter almost a week's worth of his pension, but he didn't care. This was something he needed to do. In the days leading up to the concert, Walter prepared as if for a sacred ritual. He found the faded poster from a Louis Armstrong concert in 1942, a poster that Dorothy had saved for over 20 years, that had hung in their bedroom until they moved to the smaller apartment after retirement. The poster was worn and creased, the colors faded, but Louis Armstrong's smile was still visible, still radiating the joy that had soundtracked Walter and Dorothy's entire life together. Walter decided to bring the poster to the concert, not knowing exactly why, just feeling that Dorothy should be there somehow, that something of her should be present when Walter finally saw the musician they had both loved for so long. The night of the concert, November 13, 1965, Walter dressed in his best suit. It was the same suit he had worn to Dorothy's funeral, the same suit he had worn to their 50th wedding anniversary party 2 years before her diagnosis. Walter looked at himself in the mirror and saw an old man, 74 years old, weathered by decades of factory work and recent months of grief, but also saw something else, something that surprised him. Hope. For the first time since Dorothy's passing, Walter was looking forward to something. He carefully folded the poster and tucked it inside his jacket, close to his heart, and walked out of the apartment into the cold Chicago evening. The Chicago Civic Opera House was magnificent. 12,000 seats filled with people who had come to see the legendary Satchmo, the building buzzing with anticipation and excitement. Walter found his seat in the fifth row, closer to the stage than he had expected, close enough to see everything that would happen on that stage with perfect clarity. He sat quietly as the hall filled around him, clutching the poster inside his jacket, feeling Dorothy's presence in the worn paper and faded ink. The couple next to him, a young pair probably in their 30s, smiled at Walter kindly, perhaps sensing that this elderly man sitting alone had a story, had a reason for being there that went beyond simple entertainment. When Louis Armstrong finally took the stage, Walter's breath caught in his chest. There he was, the man whose voice had filled Walter's home for 50 years, whose music had danced with Dorothy on their wedding day, whose songs had accompanied her as she left this world. Louis was older than Walter had imagined, visibly tired, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose body required extra attention. But when Louis raised his trumpet to his lips and the first notes filled the hall, none of that mattered. The sound was exactly as Walter remembered it from the records, exactly as it had sounded in their small apartment, exactly as it had sounded in Dorothy's hospital room. Walter felt tears forming in his eyes before the first song was even finished. The concert progressed, and Walter wept through most of it. Not sobs, quiet tears that rolled down his weathered cheeks while his eyes never left the stage. The young woman next to him noticed and gently touched his arm, asking if he was okay. Walter nodded, unable to speak, not wanting to explain, not sure he could explain even if he wanted to. Every song Louis played triggered memories. Dorothy dancing in their kitchen, Dorothy singing along with the radio, Dorothy holding his hand in the hospital while Louis Armstrong's voice filled the room with impossible beauty. The music was connecting Walter to his past, to his love, to everything he had lost, and everything he still carried. And then Louis Armstrong looked directly at Walter Thompson. It happened during a pause between songs when Louis was scanning the audience, as he often did, making eye contact with fans, acknowledging their presence, creating the sense of intimacy that made his performances so special. Louis's gaze swept across the fifth row and stopped on an old man with tears streaming down his face, clutching something inside his jacket, looking at Louis with an intensity that went far beyond ordinary admiration. Louis had seen many emotional fans over his 50-year career, but something about this man was different. There was a weight to his presence, a gravity to his tears, a story in his eyes that demanded attention. Louis couldn't look away. The connection lasted only a few seconds, but in those seconds something passed between the 64-year-old performer and the 74-year-old audience member, a recognition that defied explanation, an understanding that transcended words. Louis felt, without knowing how he knew, that this man had something to tell him, something important, something that Louis needed to hear. The band was waiting for Louis to start the next song. The audience was beginning to murmur with confusion, but Louis couldn't move forward. He couldn't ignore what he had just seen. Have you ever felt an inexplicable connection with a stranger? Tell us about it in the comments. Louis raised the microphone and did something he had never done before in his entire career. He spoke directly to one person in the audience, not as part of his usual banter, not as a joke or a show of showmanship, but with genuine, serious curiosity. "Sir," Louis said, his gravelly voice carrying through the silent hall, "in the fifth row, the gentleman in the gray suit. I can see you've been crying through this whole show. I have to ask you something." The entire audience turned to look at Walter Thompson. 12,000 pairs of eyes suddenly focused on an old man who had expected to remain anonymous, who had come simply to see and hear, not to be seen or heard. Walter's heart was pounding so hard he thought it might fail him right there in his seat. Louis continued, his voice gentle but insistent. "Sir, can you tell me why? Why are you crying? What brought you here tonight?" The hall was absolutely silent. No one moved, no one spoke, no one breathed. Walter Thompson looked up at Louis Armstrong, at the man whose music had saved his life, and felt 50. Years of love and loss and gratitude rising in his chest like a wave that could no longer be contained. Walter stood up slowly, his old knees protesting, his hands trembling. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the faded poster, Dorothy's poster, their poster, and held it up so Louis could see. The poster was clearly decades old, clearly cherished, clearly significant in ways that went beyond its simple function as a concert advertisement. And then Walter Thompson spoke the words that would change everything. His voice was shaky at first, barely audible, but as he continued, it grew stronger, more certain, filled with a conviction that 50 years of love had forged. "Mr. Armstrong," Walter said, "my wife Dorothy passed away 1 year ago. We were married for 53 years. She loved your music more than anything in this world. Your songs played at our wedding. Your songs played in her hospital room when she was dying. And your music—" Walter's voice broke, and he had to pause to collect himself while 12,000 people waited in breathless silence. "Your music is the only reason I'm still alive. When Dorothy left, I wanted to follow her. I didn't see any reason to keep going, but then I heard your voice, and it reminded me of her, and it gave me something to hold on to. I came here tonight because I needed to thank you before I die. I needed you to know that your music saved my life. Dorothy would have wanted me to tell you that." The silence that followed Walter's words was the most profound Louis Armstrong had ever experienced in a concert hall. 12,000 people sat motionless, many of them crying, all of them transformed by the raw honesty of what they had just witnessed. Louis stood on the stage with tears rolling down his own cheeks, not the controlled emotion of a performer, but the genuine, overwhelming response of a human being who had just received the answer to prayers he hadn't even known he was praying. This was it, This was the confirmation Louis had been seeking without realizing he was seeking it. This was proof that his music mattered, that his life's work had meaning, that all the sacrifice and exhaustion and physical pain had been worth it. Louis Armstrong stepped down from the stage. He walked into the audience, past the first row, past the second row, past the third and fourth, until he was standing directly in front of Walter Thompson. The security guards who normally would have intervened made no move to stop him. They too were crying, understanding that this moment was sacred and should not be interrupted. Louis reached out and took Walter's hands, the same hands that had held Dorothy's through 53 years of marriage, the same hands that had wiped away tears of grief in an empty apartment, the same hands that now clutched a faded poster as if it were a lifeline. "Sir," Louis said, his voice breaking, "what is your name?" Walter answered, "Walter Thompson." Louis nodded, slowly, his grip on Walter's hands tightening. "Walter Thompson," Louis repeated. "You just gave me the greatest gift anyone has ever given me. You told me that my music mattered. You told me that it made a real difference in a real life. I've been doubting myself lately, wondering if what I do has any meaning beyond entertainment. And you just answered that question in a way I will never forget." Walter was sobbing now, unable to control the emotions that decades of stoicism had kept buried, finally released by the impossible miracle of this moment. What Louis did next became legend in music history. He turned to his band and made a gesture that meant, "Wait." Then he walked Walter Thompson by the hand back toward the stage, not onto the stage, but to a chair at the very front of the audience, a chair that Louis personally placed there. "Sit here," Louis said gently. "I want to sing something just for you and for Dorothy." Walter sat, clutching the poster, unable to believe what was happening, unable to process that Louis Armstrong, the Louis Armstrong, was about to perform a private concert within a concert just for him. Louis climbed back onto the stage, picked up his trumpet, and turned to face Walter Thompson alone. The 12,000 other people in the hall might as well have vanished. Louis's eyes were locked on Walter's, his entire being focused on this one man who had just reminded him why he had dedicated his life to music. Louis raised the trumpet to his lips and began to play "What a Wonderful World," the same song that had played when Dorothy died, the same song that had kept Walter alive during his darkest days, the same song that had become the anthem of their love story. But Louis played it differently than he had ever played it before. He played it slowly, intimately, with a tenderness that made everyone in the hall feel they were intruding on something private. He played it as a letter to Dorothy, as a gift to Walter, as a testament to the power of love and music to transcend even death. When Louis began to sing, his voice carried a quality that recorded versions could never capture. It wasn't just the words, those beautiful, hopeful words about trees and skies and babies and friends. It was the emotion behind them, the genuine feeling that Louis was pouring into every syllable. He sang to Walter. He sang to Dorothy. He sang to everyone who had ever loved and lost, who had ever wondered if beauty still existed in a world marked by grief, who had ever needed a reminder that life could still be wonderful. The song lasted only 3 minutes, but those 3 minutes contained a lifetime of meaning. If this story has touched your soul, please subscribe. Moments like this deserve to be remembered. When the song ended, Louis walked back to Walter and embraced him. Two men who had been strangers an hour earlier held each other like brothers, like father and son, like two human beings who had recognized in each other the same struggles and the same needs. The audience erupted in applause, not the usual concert applause, but something deeper, something that acknowledged they had all participated in a moment of genuine human connection. People were standing, crying, hugging strangers next to them, transformed by what they had witnessed. The concert would continue. Louis would play several more songs before the evening ended, but everyone present understood that nothing would ever compare to what had just happened. After the concert, Louis invited Walter backstage. They sat together for over an hour talking about Dorothy, about music, about loss and survival, and the mysterious ways that art can heal wounds that nothing else can touch. Louis learned about Dorothy's dancing in their kitchen, about the Louis Armstrong records that had soundtracked their entire marriage, about the way music had carried Walter through his darkest days. Walter learned about Louis's doubts, about his fears that his work didn't matter enough, about the confirmation that Walter's words had provided. By the time they parted ways, both men had been changed, Walter by the knowledge that his gratitude had reached the person it was meant for, Louis by the reminder that his music was more than entertainment. Louis gave Walter something before they said goodbye, a signed photograph with a personal inscription. It read, "To Walter and Dorothy Thompson, your love story reminded me why I play. With all my heart, Louis Armstrong." Walter kept that photograph next to Dorothy's picture on his nightstand for the remaining years of his life. When Walter passed away 3 years later, peacefully, in his sleep, with Louis Armstrong's music playing softly in the background, his daughter found the photograph and the faded poster together, two artifacts of a night that had meant everything to her father. The story of Louis Armstrong and Walter Thompson became legendary among those who witnessed it and those who heard about it afterward. Musicians who were present that night told the story for years, holding it up as an example of what music could be at its best, not just entertainment, but genuine human connection, healing, transcendence. Louis himself spoke about the encounter in interviews during his final years, describing it as one of the most important moments of his career. "I had been doubting everything," Louis said in a 1969 interview, "wondering if all my work meant anything. And then this man, this 74-year-old grandfather who had lost his wife, told me that my music had saved his life. That's when I understood what I was really doing all those years. Not just making sounds, making something that could help people survive." Walter's daughter Margaret learned the full story of that night only after her father's passing. She found a letter Walter had written but never sent, a letter addressed to Louis Armstrong, thanking him again for what had happened at the concert, describing how the experience had transformed his final years. "After that night," Walter had written, "I stopped being afraid of dying. I knew that my love for Dorothy had been witnessed, had been honored, had been blessed by the man whose music had united us for 50 years. I knew that when I finally saw Dorothy again, I could tell her that I had thanked Louis Armstrong for both of us. And I knew that music really was as powerful as we had always believed it to be." Margaret donated the letter, the signed photograph, and the faded poster to the Louis Armstrong House Museum in Queens, the same museum that Lucille Armstrong had helped establish to preserve her husband's legacy. Today, visitors to the museum can see these artifacts displayed together, accompanied by a plaque that tells the story of what happened that night in Chicago. The display is one of the most popular in the museum, drawing visitors who want to see physical evidence of a story that reminds them why art matters, why human connection matters, why taking the time to say thank you can transform both the giver and the receiver. Louis Armstrong died in 1971, 6 years after that Chicago concert. He had continued performing until near the end, despite his health problems, despite the doctor's warnings, despite everything that told him he should slow down. But after the night he met Walter Thompson, Louis performed differently, not with less effort, but with a different kind of awareness. He looked into his audiences more carefully, searching for the faces that needed to be seen, the souls that needed to be touched, the stories that were waiting to be acknowledged. He understood finally that every performance was an opportunity to save someone's life, the way he had saved Walter's, to provide the soundtrack for someone's love story the way he had for Walter and Dorothy's. The legacy of that November night in Chicago extends far beyond the two men who experienced it directly. It became a story told among musicians, a reminder that what they do matters more than they might realize. It became a story told among grieving spouses, a reminder that survival is possible and that unexpected moments of grace can appear when we least expect them. It became a story told among anyone who has ever doubted whether their work, their art, their contribution to the world has any lasting value. Because if Louis Armstrong, arguably the most influential musician of the 20th century, could doubt himself, then anyone can. And if a 74-year-old grandfather's words could restore Louis's sense of purpose, then any of us might have the power to do the same for someone else. Music connects us across impossible distances. It connects us to people we've never met, to moments we'll never experience firsthand, to emotions we might never have accessed on our own. Louis Armstrong understood this intuitively from the beginning of his career, but it took Walter Thompson to show him just how deep that connection could go. A song played at a wedding, the same song played in a hospital room decades later, the same song played by a living legend to a grieving widower in front of 12,000 witnesses. The thread of that music wove through 50 years of one couple's love story, then wove into the final years of Louis Armstrong's career, then wove into history where it continues to touch everyone who hears about it. Walter Thompson went to a concert hoping to say thank you and discovered that gratitude has the power to heal the giver as much as it validates the receiver. Louis Armstrong took the stage that night doubting his purpose and discovered that his life's work had meanings he had never imagined. 12,000 strangers witnessed something so intimate and so universal that it changed how many of them understood art, love, and the mysterious connections that bind human beings together. And Dorothy Thompson, though she had been gone for over a year, was somehow present in that concert hall, in the faded poster, in her husband's tears, in the music that had carried their love story from its beginning to its end and beyond. That's the power of music. That's the legacy of Louis Armstrong. And that's why, on a November night in 1965, 12,000 people cried together, not for sadness, but for the overwhelming beauty of two souls finding exactly what they needed in each other. What a wonderful world indeed.